Hi, my name is Chang. I currently serve as the investment specialist for Geneva Benefits Group of the PCA, and glad to be here with you all.
My name is Monica Kim, and I am a licensed psychologist, but I also have deep roots and training in biblical counseling. Currently, I'm a counselor, biblical counselor and psychologist working in private practice, but also do some training and also teach counselors.
Yeah. Well, Monica, you know that I'm a big fan of your work and your ministry. You've helped my church here in California. And given your background and wealth of experience, maybe we could start off and just, if I could ask you, in the Asian American ministry context, what do you currently see as some potential challenges of applying counseling to an Asian American ministry
context? Yeah, that's a big question, but obviously I won't be able to get to many kinds of issues. But I guess what I'm thinking about is depending on the kind of the church context, whether Asian immigrant or Asian American, those are very different contexts too. So let's say, for example, I've been working in the Asian immigrant church alongside my husband as a pastoral staff and biblical counselor there for 29 years before we stepped down after, finishing up. But there were unique challenges there for sure in an Asian immigrant kind of context. Within that context, the challenge of even being able to bring more awareness to the congregation or folks around for the need for being able to find benefits or blessings via counseling, something that was not even on their minds. And so being able to even raise awareness, being able to go to the pastor, the lead pastor, meeting up with him, those are some of the things I've had to do to just raise more awareness about what that might look like. And those were some challenges, definitely. And I know that you work in you worked in an Asian American, maybe more like second gen context. And so I imagine that there are unique challenges there that you have faced too.
There's a great question. I mean, I think that part of the challenge there in the Asian context is because it's so shame-based in a lot of ways, and it's very performance-oriented. So at the church that I used to pastor, the members who are wonderful always felt sort of, according, in my opinion, a pressure to kind of present their best selves on Sundays. And they looked well-polished, their careers and families looked very manicured, and they're doing well and striving well in life, but because of just the nature of the brokenness of this world, there's a lot of issues I found in my church members that were there. But to be able to normalize that in a safe space in church was very challenging, so that people would be proactive or comfortable in feeling safe to share these, not just with the pastors, but also the community, since counseling in Asian context certainly means to bring the whole church there. And so that was a challenge. People didn't want to open up. They didn't want to be, they wanted to be more private, and they were embarrassed of all the past sins in their families and themselves. And so that certainly was a challenge within the Asian American, Korean American context. For your context, however, I think you also had a exposure and ministry to first generation Korean American as well as second gen. Did you see or experience any challenges or opportunities that were different between the first, second generation Korean American church?
Definitely in the first generation, the idea of being able to meet formally and be able to talk in a much more consistent way was something that was very challenging in the first generation, let alone the idea of counseling in the church and being able to recognize that that is something good to do. That was, really challenging. But in the second generation, I found that, like you, they were much more aware of the context of counseling or the importance of it, but because of that shame-based kind of culture, may not have really initiated, access or conversations.
I see.
But it was interesting though. In the first generation, they actually reached out more
they
for
did?
help.
Okay.
But whether
that's
it was not
surprising.
necessarily like in the context of weekly counseling.
Okay.
But they really needed help,
Okay.
and they were recognized, myself or my husband, as authorities in the church or who have had experience in counseling, and so because they knew about that, they would just reach out and
wow. Okay.
and so it's very interesting.
And so when the first gen would reach out, was it more just kind of general shepherding, or do you feel as a trained psychologist, but also a trained biblical counselor, are you able to actually apply that sort of approach or philosophy of biblical counseling to a first generation context? Will they understand the concepts? Do you have to tweak it or contextualize it somehow?
Yeah, really interestingly, I think they were more attuned to the biblical perspective.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and less so to the psychological perspectives, right? But they understood there were some issues. Let's say, for example, some of their kids, had really severe mental health issues, and they had to put their child into different kinds of institutions or programs because the school really required them to do that, right? So that may be a bit of a foray for them into entering into the need for counseling. And so they would reach out to me because that's what they were experiencing, but they really wanted a faith perspective on what was going on and the kind of services that their child had. And so, they definitely were really hoping for more biblical perspectives.
I mean, that's very helpful and very interesting between the first and second gen. I mean, it sounds like, which sort of corroborates my experience too, that maybe the second generation Korean American church is more aware, but it's a bit surprising, but it sort of makes sense as you explain it, that the first gen were actually more in tune with the biblical counseling as well as reaching out. In light of this, well, either generation, what have you seen or do you consider as even bigger potential opportunities to be able to counsel people within the community of the church?
Yeah. I still think that the kind of opportunities that biblical counselors in the Asian American context can look forward to for the Asian immigrant church, I do think that it's still difficult to have an organized kind of system of counseling. The organic reaching out and being aware of who's available, especially on a pastoral staff, is definitely something that's going to continue.
I see.
Whereas I think in more of the second and third generation context, there could be many more opportunities for developing different ways of organizing care and counseling, depending on their church size, resources, who's available. So a lot more, I think, opportunities that way to actually organize it and give a much more accessible pathway.
I mean, that's actually quite insightful, and at least in terms of like one anecdote, like my church that I used to pastor, we had the things that you said, which we're really thankful for, because we had the resources, we had both in budget and human resources who were trained counselors. And it was a wonderful experience in the sense that we really weren't sure who would actually get counseling because they wanted to be private. But what we were thankful for, on one hand, was that people were able to and wanted to actually get healing and to get guidance from a biblical perspective. And so a lot of members of the church sort of came out of the weeds, and we didn't realize that some of these members who on Sunday looked really well put together, in some ways they are, but had really deep issues and trauma from the past. And although we don't want to see that, that was a great opportunity that we saw to be able to minister to these people in a way that probably otherwise we would not have been able to do through just regular community groups or shepherding. And so, to your point, that was our experience to an opportunity to really help people in the gospel. And so that's been great. I mean, in your experience or your connections, what would you say would be either a blueprint or maybe just some practical suggestions of how can a local church incorporate biblical counseling into the ministry of the local church, whether discipleship or community groups, Sunday worship, or how would somebody begin to think about integrating this in part of a local church ministry?
Right. I think that probably, when I'm thinking about that question, I think about practical kind of application.
Okay.
But because I
Makes
think
sense.
that there has to be probably a lot of conversations
Okay.
that are going on with those who really desire to integrate, whether it's a layperson or actually someone who is trained, and really be able to talk to the leaders and those who have a bit more of an ability to organize things. I definitely, there are ways in which if one is really interested in being able to integrate on their own and in a grassroots kind of way, I think that's really hard to do. So I just think in terms of practically, one might, one of the important pieces might be to just really have a lot of conversations, a lot of open dialogue, being able to talk about it, being able to plan out and build up an imagination for how that can look like in terms of the specifics of their church, because I think that matters a lot in terms of what kind of church you have, what kind of needs you have, what kind of resources you have, and who's available. So there's just a whole host of kinds of questions that are out there. Because I don't want to be, I guess, too long-winded on that, but I have an example in terms of, after my husband and I stepped down from the more larger local Asian immigrant kind of context of ministry, we were thinking about how can we start to think about where else can we build community for ourselves in a church. So what we had done in the past year and a half, almost, about a year, but over a year, had gone to a local church plant called Hope Monco, and really started having a lot of conversations. It's a small church, and a lot of need though, even in the small church. And within the year, we had just a lot of conversations. Rich ones, hard ones, being able to have a lot of plans or build imagination, but again, lack of resources and all of that made it very difficult.
I see.
But there were ways in which we, having had all those conversations, were able to really even bring care around a particular congregant member who had a suicide attempt. And so we were able to quickly, because of all the conversations we had, quickly build up a care team, and also to think about a prayer chain, and to build up how, when she comes out of being hospitalized, how do we, because once you're hospitalized, right after you come out of hospitalization after a suicide attempt, that's like the greatest, that's another risk factor where another suicide attempt can happen. So we really mobilized to be able to do really important visitations with her, and talked about it with the parishioner, so that she would not be alone, and that we would be praying for her, because she really wanted to deeply know Jesus, because her faith was strong in the midst of what had happened for her.
It's a wonderful testimony. Obviously heartbreaking to hear about that member, but to hear that the church has come around to conversations to take care of a member that went through something as traumatic as that is wonderful to hear. What would you say, kind of piggybacking onto that example, even if it's hypothetical, a lot of the members who go through really deep trauma and experiences need long-term community and care, and sometimes the members of the church may not be able to provide for that, or maybe we have to encourage them. How do you see in various church sizes or in your experience that the church can provide that long-term care? Because even pastors have maybe many people to do that with, so they can't be around for everyone. Should it be the leaders, or should it just be a care team, or could it be their community groups or lay members, or all of the above depending on the culture? Or what are your thoughts about the long-term care after?
Having been on kind of both sides, been doing and still continuing to do counseling in the local church, but also being a psychologist, oftentimes in the professional health fields, mental health fields, there's a real important kind of emphasis on helping the patient build up community and a support system, right? Because mental health professionals, while they can provide a lot of professional support, and that's very important, whether for long-term care in terms of medication or continuing kind of counseling. At the same time, there's also a lot of limitations. And as a person who's on that side, also really focusing in on difficult, more severe issues, there is an emphasis, I emphasize, how can you connect to a local community with whom you feel really safe and supported? And so I really believe that's where the church can come in. And that is an important part of the ministry. Not, recognizing our limitations, recognizing that we don't have the professional training, but we definitely do have that community where folks who have really need for longer term care will, benefit from that kind of safe, kind of supportive community where they can be preyed upon, or they can have visitations. They can just really, find connections, and they don't feel alone. Now, how do you do that is another kind of, I think, an important piece. I do think that there needs to be a lot of good communication between folks who are in the church or who may be leading up the kind of the ministry, pastoral ministry, to be able to talk to those whom, who are the professionals. But also, I guess, there's so many kind of facets to this, but I'm just touching upon a couple of those pieces. And I think it is important to be able to, in the church, spread out the care versus just have the pastor or, the next kind of associate pastor take care of those who are in greater need.
That's quite insightful. And I think, as you mentioned, you're touching the surface of several pieces that the church can be able to provide long-term care. If I could back up a little bit and say, on the one hand, that every church probably would want a Monica at their church with your background and heart and love for the Lord, but your expertise and your giftedness towards counseling and care. But unfortunately, not every church can have a Monica Kim. So assuming that a church has all these conversations and really wants to build some sort of counseling ministry, but they just don't know where to start, what would be their first step before to kind of developing or getting some knowledge of even defining biblical counseling? Is there a website or what would you or a person to connect with, or how would they begin to think about that?
I think in the Asian American context, there are now more people who have been trained in biblical counseling, or who are a bit more on the ground, who are, within their context, have built up a counseling ministry. And so while I don't think there's like one site to go to, I think like your wife and yourself, right? I imagine, you could speak to or be able to support just, a direction or the kind of conversations folks can have, and the kind of research that they may need to do to be able to, in their context, build up, an imagination for what would care and counseling look like. So, that's a tough question. I think I think it would be great to consolidate, all those kinds of resources, and maybe even have a way, maybe even Sola,
Sola
can be able to pull all of that together and be able to, build some kind of a website where there are more resources or folks who are willing to answer some questions.
Actually, I mean, that's, again, that's very helpful, because Sola actually has been like a great resource to find connection to different churches and pastors who believe in this. And even at New Life Pres, when the counseling director, Kathy, was trying to start the center, even though she had a degree in it, part of it is like, how do you build a vision? How do you actually, on the kingly side, incorporate and be able to implement this vision? And it was through connections of pastors and through Sola that a lot of resources, such as yourself, or Jonathan Holmes, or Timothy St. John, were just a tremendous blessing and resource to do this. We are coming down to our last minutes, but maybe as a closing sort of a word of encouragement, what, I guess, would you want to say to churches, Asian American churches, about implementing or learning about or applying in some version of a biblical counseling ministry at their churches? What would be some of your encouragements to these pastors and leaders in churches?
Yeah, I think just even the Asian American church starting to build up more desire for and hope for how to implement or put into place counseling and care in the Asian American church is really heartening.
Yeah.
So just even being able to have this conversation is actually
great.
quite heartening.
Sure.
And I would also say to really start small and think about modest places to be able to just integrate in ways that you can in the church. And I do think that ultimately, because we trust in the grace of God that is abounding, I feel so much hope, whether there's counseling in the church or not going on, that God is always providing for His people. And that I would say is most encouraging.
Yeah, that's a good word and a deep encouragement to the churches that ultimately it is Jesus' body and His church, and He cares for His sheep in ways that even humans like us will not begin to fathom, and gave His life for this. And so we continue to strive and hopefully build a counseling community or a community that loves on each other. And I think the church will mature and will suffer along, but God's grace will sustain us through. So that's an excellent word. But I think we're out of time. But Monica, I appreciate your thoughts and your expertise, and thank you so much for your thoughts and your wisdom around this issue. And so I'm sure it'll be a blessing to the people who listen to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.